All right. So without thinking too much, I want you to raise your hand if you see the young lady in the photo. Raise your hand if you see the older woman in the photo. And let's go ahead and raise your hand if you don't see either women or if you see something else. Okay, so this is an illusion that's also called an ambiguous figure. And it really helps us to kind of think about the fact that people look at things differently in the world, right? So there are two different truths about this photo depending on what you were thinking about looking at, what your history is. There's all sorts of reasons why some people see the young woman and some people see the elder woman first. And this is something that's important to think about when we are approaching and thinking about problems, especially because most problems have no single solution, or in some cases those problems may be unsolvable altogether, and instead there are what we call polarities that you have to then manage instead of solve. And so you have these two polarities, one and another one that you have to kind of move between as like a spectrum. And when we think about those kinds of problems, the one that we're going to be talking about today is a polarity that probably has come up for most of you in your development career, which is whether you should build something or whether you should buy something. And today we're going to be specifically talking about how having Rails like in our corner can help us to make this decision a little bit better than if we were using any other tools or frameworks that are out there. So welcome, my name is Colin Loretz. I am a software engineer at a company called Orbit. We build software to help product owners manage and grow their communities. And with that, it means a lot of third-party API integrations. And so my history has been mostly around building APIs and consuming APIs on both ends. And most recently been working with the team to figure out how can we build integrations in a sustainable way and have our customers have more places that they can get data in and out of our service. So how many people, show of hands one more time, have had to have this kind of decision in your company, in your side projects? Okay, just about everybody. Build versus buy is something that you see in business classes. You see it probably come up in all hands meetings, retros, things like that, which is, should we build something? And kind of like the polarity that I was talking about earlier, do we build it fully from scratch? Do we find something off the shelf that lets us kind of meet in the middle, whether that's a gem or a library? Or do we go work with one of the many software as a service companies that might offer things like docs, payments, search, things like that? And then what kinds of options do we have in between these two poles? So these are some of those examples that I just mentioned. For any one of these, I think payments is probably the one that you probably won't go out and build from scratch because it's hard. But like docs, you could roll your own full documentation website, or you can use open source tools like Swagger and others to then host those on various platforms that offer docs as a service, webhook delivery, integrations, hosting, infrastructure, logging, and so forth. And then there kind of lies this yes and approach. So we can kind of borrow this from our improv friends, which is we can also do both. In fact, in most cases, your company or your tech team, you're not going to be able to build everything, and you're not going to be able to buy everything. So you can think of this as sometimes it makes sense for us to build something, sometimes it makes sense for us to buy something, and in some cases, like with integrations, you might want to do both. You might build some, buy some, hire consultancies to work with you to build other ones. And so it's a continuum that you can think about that, again, doesn't have a single answer, a single solution. So just to kind of go through a quick use case of this, we're going to get to the Rails specific piece of this in a second, but I just want to kind of take you through the build and buy decision that we went through for integrations and what we ultimately ended up deciding on. And so for us, we already had 5 core integrations that we had built into our product, and we needed to think through like how are we going to get to the next 15, 20 integrations that we want to add to Orbit. And then with that, I'll offer them to our customers so that they can get value in importing their data into our tool. And so with that, we had some goals. how do we add new integrations in a sustainable way without burning out the team, right? Every integration that we add increases the surface area of APIs that we need to watch, docs that we need to learn, tools that we need to basically build to. And then this is almost its own polarity unto itself, which is how do we know what are the right things that we should integrate with, right? What's the next integration that we want to build? What's going to be the one that we can maybe hold off on? If you're customer facing, like we are, every company is asking for every integration that they, currently use in their tech stack. So how do we balance that polarity of which ones do we build and which ones do we wait? And then how do we simplify our code base? How can we add code, or in the case of build, or if we're buying something, can we simplify our code base and make it so that we don't have a really, really complex code base that we have to onboard new developers to every single time we make a hire? And then finally, how can we sleep at night? If you've ever integrated with an API, how do we make sure that we're not getting woken up by pages in the middle of the night, that we know that APIs aren't breaking underneath us, and that we make sure that everything is functioning as we want. And so for each of these kind of APIs that we build to, these are just some of the considerations that we have to think about. We're not going to go into every one of these, but every integration needs to think about authentication, it needs to think about the docs, it needs to think about who's going to maintain it over time. And so really quickly, this starts to build a feature list for an integration as a service company, or if we build this, we kind of have to check all these things off so that we are able to, again, sleep at night and know that the code is running and that we're not having to worry about whether or not our integrations are working. So with all of these considerations, how do we make a decision? It really quickly, and we're thinking about integrations here, but you can kind of think of this as if you're going to build search into your product, or you're going to build messaging with maybe SMS or email. Does it make sense for you to go and do all of that yourself? Or with all these considerations, does it make sense for you to go out and find something in market? So the first step is collecting inputs. This one is really figuring out from your team, what has your team done before? Is there an appetite on the team to buy something, to build something? Have we bought something in the past, and did it go well? Did it go not so well? Part of this is figuring out what the team's DNA is. A lot of teams have, you probably heard like not invented here syndrome. Everything gets built from scratch. Sometimes those teams are not always good about shipping things. So there's a little bit of a balance there about when do we build things, when do we buy things, and when, again, do we meet in the middle there. Discovery and research, figuring out not only what has been done in your team, but figuring out what's been done in your language or your framework or your industry that you can build on, right? Just because you might build something doesn't mean you need to build it completely from scratch and reinvent the wheel all over again. With this one, we found a really great blog from a consultancy called Blended Edge, and they're an integration consultancy. So they didn't have code for us to look at, but they had just blog posts on every little thing that we were talking about in those considerations. If you've ever dealt with an API, their blog, if you read through it, you just will find yourself just nodding your head as they kind of empathize around all the issues that you run into when integrating with APIs. And then finally, we just have a lot of trade-offs. So we need to think about how big is the team. If you're the only programmer and the co-founder, you probably should not build everything, right? It makes sense to borrow the capabilities of using something for a payment platform, using something for docs, and so forth. How big is the company in terms of stage, product market fit? If you're trying to figure out where the company is and is a customer even going to use this thing, it probably doesn't make sense to go out and build everything from scratch and make it the most perfect thing that's ever been built, assuming that someone's actually going to use it, right? We may end up finding that customers don't want that. We're going to end up pulling it from the code base. And so stage, company type, right? If you're bootstrapped, you might have more time than cash. If you're a funded company, you might have more money than time, vice versa. The big one here is that we see startups that will pivot themselves to death because they think, oh, if we build this, then customers will pay us. We only have 2 months left of runway left. It's not a good formula for building something from scratch in 2 months. Engineering culture. So this goes back to that DNA, right? Have we been bit before buying something or building something? Are we good at shipping new greenfield projects, or are we better at incremental improvements, integrating with third parties, things like that? And then general technology risk, right? So whether you build or buy, if you then also go pick new technologies you've never used before, now we're starting to spend innovation tokens in things that are completely new to you and your team. And so there's going to be some implementation and technology risk there. And then finally, there's going to be costs. So hard costs, time, energy, how much time and effort. If you buy something, those are going to come with physical costs or financial costs. And then you have opportunity costs, right? If you build this, what aren't you going to build that you could have built in that time if you decided to go with a buy option? So these are just a couple questions that might be useful for you to ask your team, right? Is this a feature that is core to what we offer our customers, or is it like table stakes? Do we all need to be able to send emails to our customers? We probably shouldn't reinvent that wheel. Are we an email service provider? Well, we should probably be really good at that and not be working with an underlying service that we're paying for underneath that. Again, what are we good at? What's been done before? And what could we do with the time that we would essentially gain if we bought something? So what did that look like for us, and kind of how does that correlate into Rails? So looking at the build side of things, our pros and cons here were, for us being able to build this, which is something that we already were doing, it meant having full ownership end-to-end of the customer experience, the data flows. We can do anything that we can do in Rails, right? We then would actually build our ability to build integrations in the future, right? So it's a lot like working out at the gym. You're putting in reps, you're building a muscle for creating integrations. And in our case, we were actually able to leverage the prior art of our first 5 integrations. So we had a little bit of a head start where we got to practice doing the build, and we can use that in our pro-con list here. And then this one we haven't gotten to yet, but we are exploring the idea of like, what if our API connectors could also be open so that we could share those with other developers and then also benefit from other connectors being created in the future. And then the last one I have is both a pro and a con. So it's a pro in that having an integration team, if you're focused on integrations, is going to mean that you're going to have better integrations. It is a con if you do not have the time, resources, or funding to have a dedicated integration team. And so those are things to consider. Definitely on the con side of things, longer startup time, more code that we have to think about maintaining, and again, that implementation risk with new technologies. So back to that blended edge consultancy that I mentioned before, they really focus on the idea here that if you're going to be successful in building, you really have to make it part of your company culture. And again, I would repeat that to say that doesn't mean building everything, that means building the right things. And you do need to make sure that you have a team that focuses on those specific things. On the buy side, we're basically looking at the ones that are asterisks here are essentially some of the marketing that comes from a lot of these companies, which is that the speed to implementation should theoretically be faster. A lot of the infrastructure pieces of this are going to be offloaded to the service that you're paying for. I've asterisked those two mostly because those were big maybes for us. They were we see how it could take less time to build, but we could also see how it may take just as long as us building it ourselves. The tricky thing with integrations is that they are like icebergs that look very small from the top, and everything is kind of hidden underneath. And so in most cases, and to kind of clarify here, what we were looking at was buying an integration platform as a service. So there are now companies that, just like you might hook up to a Stripe for payments as a service, you can have integrations as a service. And so having less code to maintain overall, having a large connector library, these were all really appealing pros. But on the con side, we're looking at hard-coded logic and lowest common denominator limitations, which is a one-size-fits-all, right? These companies are offering integrations that are designed for all of their customers for you to plug into. And then you end up with pricing, vendor lock-in as potential options. If you go down this route, you need to think about what's going to happen if we made the wrong decision and we want to move to a different service or eventually build it ourselves. And then the last two were really the two cons that spoke the most to us, which was that it requires the team to learn vendor-specific tooling or even a specific language. So this might be a drag-and-drop interface that was made to make programming easier, but it's still very niche, very specific to the implementation by the vendor. And then ultimately, you end up renting that capability instead of owning it, right? So that you don't end up building the muscle to build integrations. You rent the ability to offer those integrations to your customers, which, depending again on your stage and your team size, it might be the right call to rent. Similar to renting and owning a home, right? It might make sense to rent if you move a lot. It might make sense to buy if you're going to stay put for a really long time. So back to Blended Edge, they really recommend here that you can go the custom route if you think that you should build out, whatever feature that is you're building. In our case, integrations as a core engineering discipline. If for whatever reason, again, funding, team size, whatever that might be, if you don't think it's a competitive advantage, it might make sense to actually find a partner or something that you can work with in the middle. So now shifting to, that's all the business slides out of the way of like why you might do one or the other. And really what was interesting about this is that we didn't write any code up until this point. This was really the process that we went through, the whole engineering team thinking through what are the pros, what are the cons, what if we get this right, what if we get it wrong. And it ultimately landed on us thinking we already had a really good language and a really good framework for building what we wanted to build. And so we ended up landing on being able to have Ruby everywhere. So instead of having vendor-specific tooling and languages, everything can be in Ruby. And we can take advantage of the team that we have and the tools that we have already to build out our integrations in a better way than we were doing before. So that brought us to building an internal project that we called Constellation. So the idea being Constellation connects stars, Constellation connects us to other APIs, and it has these 6 core tenets here, which is API connectors, which in our case were actually just pure Ruby objects. So no fancy IDEs and drag and drop tools and things like that. It's how do we as Orbit talk to Slack, Twitter, API, and so forth. And with those connectors, those are the ones that I was talking about potentially being able to be open so that other developers can contribute to them. And then we were already using background jobs, so we were already using Sidekick for that, but we now use Sidekick Enterprise, which gives us access to the Sidekick enterprise rate limiting. And so if you've worked with APIs, you need to stay within certain rate limits by client, by company, by even a global limit in some cases. And so we're using the Sidekick rate limits for that. And we were even able to make our own HTTP client so that the Ruby code running in Sidekick is aware of the rate limits that each service puts on us. And so now inside of those jobs, we have ETL pipelines running. Those pipelines, ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. So we're extracting data from the source system, transforming it into the data that we need for Orbit, and then loading it into Orbit. And so we're actually using a gem called Kiba for this. Again, it's more Ruby. It's a great way to define a declarative ETL pipeline. And so those pipelines can now run inside of Sidekick, stay within the rate limits. And at this point now, we've added 2 dependencies to Orbit, and we're starting to think about how do we maintain some of the goals that we had before, which were how do we make the code simpler? How do we make sure that as we add 10 more integrations, we aren't just convoluting the Orbit code base. And so for packaging and internal tooling, we actually went with Shopify's Packwork, which is a really cool gem that I recommend checking out. It basically allowed us to take everything that was Constellation specific and put it in a specific package. And then we can define the internally public and private methods that we can then call so that the Orbit code base can stay where it was, and then we add integrations within Rails in its own package, and we can do tests, we can do everything we can do in Ruby inside of those packages. And then next up, testing. So we are able to test Constellation itself. We're able to test the actual integrations and the API connectors to the various API services. and then record fixtures from each of those with VCR so that we know, has an integration, like an API changed under us, have those responses changed over time, whether it's like new methods, new attributes, so that we can see if our tests break over time. So a little bit of unit testing and a little bit of integration testing. And then finally, this one was probably the most fun to see happen, which was to kind of put the Rails bow on all of it, was that we also created a Rails generator for constellations. So now we can basically have all of these wrapped up into a single line where we can now generate all the scaffolding for a new integration. So we can say HubSpot in this case, and then define a few like key models that we want to generate, and then it'll generate all the scaffolding for a new engineer to start on a new integration. So that was kind of the Rails piece, which was really exciting to see, going from tools that we were already using and some of the code that we, in some cases, each of those 5 integrations that we built were worked on by, in some cases, 5 different engineers. And so Constellation was able to kind of give us a backbone in terms of how each integration was designed. So a quick retro, how did it go? Did we make the right decision? Was it worth it? What would we have done differently? So in our case, it really has allowed us to go. So when the company started, we went from having 0 to, it took about a year to get to 5 integrations. And then in the last month and a half or so, we've got 5 new integrations. So our kind of time to adding new integrations is going to be picking up. It still means that we have to think through what are the right integrations to build. Just because we now can build them faster doesn't mean that we should build them all. And so that's still something that we have to think about. The integrations in general, though, were kind of like our common enemies. So in our case, the team has really come together and strengthened around the common enemy being, how do we solve integrations? How do we do that better? And we built that integration capabilities so that any new integration that comes along our desk is something that we don't have to immediately say, oh, we don't know how to do that. We have the muscle to be able to do that. So for right now, it's working. Granted, it's working for now, right? So the way that we've thought this through is what would happen if we needed to, either add a buy component to this, or what if 6 months from now we decide we made an awful mistake and we shouldn't have done this? So what could this look like for you as you start to think about how you integrate with any one of these build versus buy decisions, right? Whether it's docs, whether it's payments, whether it's integrations. You want to avoid spending innovation tokens all in one place. So there's a really great blog post if you search for innovation tokens. And I'm going to not spoil the blog post, but you really don't want to do all new technologies everywhere, right? Choose boring technology, choose something that you're good at, choose something that your team knows well. And as we add new engineers to the team, it's just Ruby, right? So there's not going to be picking up something and be like, what's under here? No surprises when it comes to Ruby. Design clean interfaces. So this is where Packwork really helped us because we could add an integration platform as a service later, and we have those clean interfaces that we can now use to swap out our built integrations. We could even make it so that there's integrations running in other languages, and we have an API that we could basically spin up those different integrations behind. Standing on the shoulders of giants. So looking at what gems are available, looking at what other companies have done. I think like with e-commerce, looking at the difference between working with Shopify or building something on Spree is a good example, right? You're still building on top of Spree, which is open and a gem, or working with Shopify, and in many cases still being able to build and customize on top of Shopify. Those are, again, a polarity to manage there. And then finally, why not both? So a lot of these gems have pro features, right? I mentioned Sidekick Pro. Kiba also has pro features, so there's a way to build on top of open source and still have a little bit of a build and buy without having to write every single line of code in there. And with that, we've got about 5 minutes for any questions or anything that comes to mind. Yeah, so this is a good example. So to repeat the question, how often, in my experience, have we gone from like a build turns into a buy or vice versa? It'll tend to be like when you're a small team and maybe don't have as much funding, there are really great services where they're giving credits to startups, and or in many cases, if you follow the tutorials of a lot of things, it's like take these 2 APIs, put them together, and you have this app, right? And in the reality, it's like once the real world meets that app, you're going to blow through all of the limits that were on the free plan and on all of that. But in many cases, it still doesn't make sense to get off of it once you have to start paying for it, because let's use like a search as a service company as an example. Running your own search cluster is going to cost you time, money, engineers, right? And so it would probably make sense for a good while to do that, right? And we choose, in our case, we run on Heroku. We're not innovating on where we're hosting and deploying to. We're spending that time and energy on how we integrate with those APIs instead. But like in our case, we used to use a search as a service company, and then because we had those clean interfaces, we were able to swap it out for our own search cluster when we were ready. So some of it's like growing into it, but then the nice thing is it doesn't really hurt to be able to swap it out if you think of that ahead of time. I would say you don't want to over-optimize for that either, like being able to make everything into an interface, but where you might need to. I've worked on a few things where we needed to switch out payment providers or support multiples, and so that's where that might come into mind. Thank you. Definitely, yeah. So when I was having these conversations, I was pretty new at the company too, so there was also like, okay, I felt the pressure to pick the right thing, but with like an integration platform, in our case, we already are integrating with a third party, and they might go down. So do we want to put another party in the middle of us that might also have issues? Or like if they're having an issue, what can we do? And that was really the biggest risk that we had to think about. For us, we talked to the whole company. It wasn't just engineers. It was like, what is our appetite for risk? What is it going to look like for us to be able to, like, can we tell our customers, like, oh, it's not us? That's not probably a good enough answer for some of them, especially if we have our own SLAs to the customer. And so it's definitely something to consider. I would add that to the trade-offs question is, what do you have to guarantee? And then if, in some cases, another company might be able to guarantee it more than you yourself can guarantee it. And so it might make sense that way. And payments is one of the ones that comes to mind because most of us aren't going to be a bank. And so banks are pretty good at being banks. Yeah, so repeat the question, red flags when you're building versus buying. Yeah, so I think it can be tempting. We like to solve problems, and so it can be really tempting to build, especially when you start to look at prices for what it costs to buy. But I think the cost of engineering salaries and team, and that the team may not be the same team when the project is done, is a big one. If projects that you work on tend to slip a lot, in a perfect world, doing this project may never finished. In some companies I've worked in before, it never saw the light of day, whereas with this one, we really had to scope it down and say what's like the minimum that we can do to get it out and get us using it, because we know we're not going to get it right the first time, and we know we're going to add to it. But making sure, again, that there's like, in our case, having that contract with Packwork between Constellation and Orbit helped us realize like, oh, we forgot about that thing that we need to deal with. So now we need to add that to the scope. It can be really, I had implementation risk written down. It can really get away from you if you don't have a good project manager. In our case, Constellation was like a really big project. This could just as well have been, the search bar at the top of your website, which doesn't diminish all the work that goes on behind that search bar. There's a lot, but it's still like, some things are features and some things are like a whole capability that's a piece of your app that you kind of need to think, what is your appetite for the risk of if this goes well and if it doesn't go well? Yeah, so the question's around like disagreements between business and tech side of the house. Build and buy, yeah. So I would say like this one is surprising because a lot of engineers will be surprised at how much things cost, whereas the business side is like, yeah, let's just buy it, right? Because we can't either, maybe it's hard to find engineers right now, which is the case for most people, so it might be better to be able to have like a dedicated integration team through an integration service or search service and so forth. And then you will always get engineers, so I think on the business side, it's almost always the safer choice to buy, because now they can go blame the vendor, right, if something's wrong. Versus on the engineering side, it's really easy to say, oh, it's easy to build, right? And I try never to use that will be easy, like ever, when I think about like how hard can it be, right? And so when you look at those lists of considerations, they add up really quickly. And I think when you see one company might have like 100 integrations, you start to think, look, if they have 100, like how hard can it really be? And that's where you realize, oh, they are using an integration platform or they have their own framework. So there will be disagreements. You got to have those conversations. In our case, I even had to ask the question, like, can we afford this thing? If we can't, can we afford the time from the engineering team for this? If they're working on that, we have to assume that they're not also working on these other things. And so you do have to get alignment on that before this will really work. Awesome. Any other questions? Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for your time.